Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today I'm going to be doing a 2020 election prediction between Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and current U.S. President Donald Trump. So Bernie Sanders, as most of you know, is a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. He's advocated heavy taxation of the top 1% in order to benefit the middle class. He unsuccessfully ran for the Democratic nomination in 2016, and he's also the most popular politician in the United States in terms of approval. So before I begin calling states, I just want to say that I think Bernie Sanders is the best candidate to go against Donald Trump in 2020, and this is mostly because of his popularity throughout the United States and the fact that he already has a strong political movement behind him. And with this in mind, I believe that he could do very well against Trump, and I think you'll see that as I start to call states and explain why. Okay, so let's just call the safe states, and with this video in particular, you will notice that quite a few states, you're already starting to see that quite a few states would not be safe for Trump that usually are, such as Nebraska's 1st district and its 2nd district. Montana and North Dakota would not be solidly safe in his column. Missouri would not be safe in Donald Trump's column. Indiana, because of Mike Pence, I would say is safe in his column, but only because of that factor. I believe most of the Northeast would be safe in his column. This includes New Hampshire and Maine's 1st and 2 electoral votes. Utah wouldn't be safe in Donald Trump's column either, and I'll explain all of this as I work my way through. So, Bernie Sanders has a very good ability at grassroots campaigning. I've covered this in many of my other prediction videos when I brought up his name. There's no other candidate who is better at grassroots campaigning than Bernie Sanders is. And when you have a good grassroots campaign, you can make states competitive that normally are not. Like, for example, Utah. In the most recent poll, Donald Trump's net approval is at 0, meaning his approval is at 50 and his disapproval is at 50. If Bernie Sanders were the candidate, he could drive out turnout using grassroots campaigning and make this state competitive. But, however, I don't believe that that's a very likely scenario. So for that reason, I would call Utah as likely red as the first call for this video. I might as well talk about states that normally are not safe for the Democrats, like New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders is from the Northeast. I believe that he is the face of the Northeast, and I believe that there is not a chance that Donald Trump can take New Hampshire from Bernie Sanders. I really don't think there is. As for Maine's 2nd, it's the same argument. Bernie Sanders is from the Northeast. He has very, very good appeal to Northeastern voters. He could definitely take that. Those 2 electoral votes. The 2nd district I would only consider not solid in his column because of how strong it went to Donald Trump in 2016, but that's a long shot. The states of New Mexico and Colorado I'd also consider safe in Bernie Sanders' column, and this is because of 2 different factors. Hispanic turnout, which I think would be a big factor for Bernie Sanders, even though he is not Hispanic. I believe he has great appeal to the Hispanic community. Colorado, this may seem like kind of a ridiculous argument, but Bernie Sanders is kind of the face of marijuana legalization, and in a state like Colorado, I believe that will drive out voters, and with a combination of grassroots campaigning, this state would go solidly in his column. New Mexico, considering Bernie Sanders' great grassroots campaigning, his appeal in this state, Donald Trump's already low approval rating in this state, Bernie Sanders would take this state solidly. I don't think there's a chance that Trump could take it. And Kansas is a state that I don't think would go solidly in Trump's column either. I think it's likely. And as we've seen recently, Bernie Sanders has been holding rallies in this state. There are a lot of Kansas progressives that would definitely go out and vote for Bernie Sanders, but I don't think that's enough to flip the state from red to blue, so for that reason it'd be likely in his column. Montana I would consider likely in Trump's column as well. There's not much of a chance at any Democrat taking this state. I think that the only reason this state would be likely is if the governor who's a Democrat and the senator, or one of the senators who's a Democrat, could go out and campaign for Bernie Sanders with a combination of his grassroots campaigning, but that's a long shot in itself, so it'd be likely. Missouri I consider likely as well. The only reason I think this state could go from red to blue is Donald Trump's low approval rating and Bernie Sanders' great grassroots campaigning strategy, which I think would be a tremendous factor in almost every single state. As for Maine's 2nd, I'd still consider that likely in Bernie Sanders' column. Although this district did go to Trump by a solid margin in 2016, Bernie Sanders is from the Northeast, and I believe he could most likely take this district. I believe it should be solid in this column, but I'm going to consider all factors and call it likely. As for Texas, even with Bernie Sanders, I consider Texas to be likely. Bernie Sanders may have great appeal across the United States, but I think Texas is the exception. I think the only kind of candidate on the Democrat side that can win Texas is a Hispanic, maybe native voter like Julian Castro, which I covered before. And North Dakota, essentially the same argument as Montana. Bernie Sanders' great appeal to voters up here. I believe his socialist principles will connect with many North Dakota progressives, which there are a surprising amount of that just don't show up to elections. And Donald Trump already has a low approval rating to begin with, lower than Montana in the state, so I'd call it likely for that reason. Virginia, I would call likely for Bernie Sanders, and this is mostly because this state did not go to him in the primary from last year and don't believe it would go to him again if he were the candidate, and this is because this is much more of a Hillary Clinton Democrat type of state. They don't really align themselves too much with the progressive movement. They align themselves more so with the ideology of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. It's the most Democratic Party kind of state, I think, in the United States. At least the Democratic base here. I don't think that this state is safe in the Democrats' column, the same way that Texas may be the face of the GOP, but it isn't safe in their column. I think that's a good comparison between the two. Georgia, I would call likely. I'm tempted to call it a lean to Trump, just because I think grassroots campaigning does play a factor down here. But Bernie Sanders' real appeal, I think, is in the Midwest, as you can see here. And I don't think he could have great appeal to Georgia and Southern voters in general. Michigan, I would call likely in Bernie Sanders' column. I think he would have tremendous appeal to Rust Belt voters, almost as much as he would have appeal to Midwestern voters. And this is because his message is all about the middle class. That was one of Hillary's main mistakes in 2016. She lost sight of advocacy for the middle class, and she started to advocate instead strongly for women's rights, LGBT rights, which is good, which is what a Democrat should be doing. But they can't lose sight of advocating for the middle class, which is why she lost the Rust Belt, at least in my opinion. And that's why Donald Trump swooped in, because he did have a strong advocacy for the middle class. Bernie Sanders, however, I believe could take the entire Rust Belt, maybe not Ohio. I'm going to discuss that in a second, because Donald Trump's message, I think, is failing many voters in these states, and I believe his negative approval in these states reflect that, and I believe that Bernie Sanders' message of middle-class support will overwhelm Donald Trump's. So with that said, I would call Wisconsin as well likely for the same argument I just made, and the fact that it has even a lower approval than Michigan of Donald Trump in the state. Pennsylvania I would also call likely for the same logic. Bernie Sanders can have appealed to urban voters and suburban voters alike with his grassroots campaigning strategy, making the state likely in his column. Nevada, I would call likely in Bernie Sanders' column as well, given his Hispanic appeal, which may not be as strong since he is not Hispanic himself, but I believe would be a factor regardless, since he does have great appeal amongst the Hispanic community. So for that reason, I call Nevada likely in his column, which is mostly a combination of Donald Trump's low approval in this state and the fact that I would call it in his column either way. I'm just considering all factors. Nebraska's second, I would call... Oh, and I forgot to call Nebraska's first as well. I don't think that would go in Bernie Sanders' column. It would likely go in Trump's column, but I believe that Bernie Sanders can campaign well in that area. As for the second, I believe it would be like a lean in his column, given Donald Trump's low approval rating and Bernie Sanders' appeal to Midwestern voters. If not likely, it's just hard to call single districts in general in election predictions. Iowa, I would call a lean in Bernie Sanders' column. And this is he's the one Democrat that I would call a lean for. And this is because in order to win Iowa, and I've said this in the past, you have to have a good grassroots campaigning strategy, and Bernie Sanders is all about grassroots campaigning. He could take this state from Donald Trump, mostly because, well, not mostly, but Donald Trump does have a low approval in this state, more than most other states that are competitive, which I didn't even realize. And Bernie Sanders narrowly lost this state during the Democratic primaries, and I believe that he would win the state in an election between Donald Trump. So for that reason, I would put it a lean in this column. Minnesota, I skipped over. I believe it goes solidly in Bernie Sanders' column, just because it's the most Democratic state of the Rust Belt, and Bernie Sanders already has good appeal amongst Rust Belt voters, as you can already see. So for that reason, be solidly in this column, which makes Bernie Sanders the next president with 286 electoral votes. But we are not done yet. Arizona, I would put a lean in Trump's column. I think that progressives still don't really have a good shot at winning Arizona, and this is mostly because it's still developing into a Democratic state, and I don't think that many especially Arizona Republicans, could connect with Bernie Sanders' socialism. I believe that socialism still is a dirty word throughout much of the United States, and I believe that's one of the only negatives that could go against Bernie Sanders. And what's interesting is that Bernie Sanders is more of a social democrat than a democratic socialist, and for those of you who don't know the difference, you can look it up. It's essentially the same as a capitalist, a social democrat with socialist principles involved, but for some reason he still calls himself a democratic socialist, and I think he would do much better amongst other voters if he would not put socialists in his title. Same with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's doing the same thing. I don't understand why. Maybe just to be provocative, but it isn't really helping them much. They'd probably do just as fine if they didn't call themselves socialists. But regardless, Arizona would be a lean in Trump's column. North Carolina I'd call a lean in Trump's column as well. I believe that Bernie Sanders could do pretty well in this state amongst minorities, but I believe that Donald Trump could take the state. He has good approval in this state, well, fairly decent approval, and I currently call it a narrow lead to Trump. Florida, I would call to Bernie Sanders by a lean. This is essentially the same argument that I've made over and over and over again. Good grassroots campaigning strategy, a pretty fair minority appeal on Bernie Sanders' side, and I know that Donald Trump's approval is up in this state, but still, I don't think that he would lose, that Trump would lose against Bernie Sanders in Florida, given his huge political movement, especially down in Florida. You'd be surprised. I believe that there'd be peaks trying in places like Miami, Jacksonville, Orlando. That would really be the heart of Bernie Sanders' win in a state like Florida. And then Ohio, which I think is the hardest state to call. I would call narrowly in Trump's column, essentially for the same argument I made for Arizona. I believe that Trump can really use Bernie Sanders' socialism title against him in this state, because Ohio voters, I think, cringe at hearing the name of socialism still. And I don't believe that the progressive movement in Ohio is particularly strong. I mean, I think the progressive movement is strong everywhere, but in Ohio, it is not as strong as the rest of the Rust Belt. So for that reason, I'd call it narrowly in Trump's column. And this, of course, makes Bernie Sanders the hypothetical next president of the United States with 315 electoral votes, which I believe is the most I've given any candidate so far, which makes sense and I think is a pretty fair call to make. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He is an independent who just chooses to run the Democratic Party, and I believe that's one thing that also worked great for him, is because many voters don't want to vote Democrat because they're dissatisfied with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party alike, so they don't want to vote Democrat. But Bernie Sanders really isn't a Democrat the same way that Trump isn't really a Republican. They both hijack their own parties in order to spread their own principles, and whether that's a good or bad thing I can leave up to you, but Bernie Sanders still is not technically a Democrat. He's just running a Democratic Party, and I think that'll work well for him. His strong message that really appeals to most voters throughout the United States. Trump supporters, a lot of Trump supporters support Bernie Sanders, which surprises a lot of people. Midwestern voters support Bernie Sanders. Minorities support Bernie Sanders. Rust Belt voters support Bernie Sanders. His appeal is almost universal. It's really astounding, the movement that Bernie Sanders has around him. And it makes sense that he's the most popular politician in the United States. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope it provided pretty sound logic around Bernie Sanders, because I do believe that he is the best candidate, and I hope that you guys would agree with my logic. And if you have any suggestions, as always, please feel free to leave them down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.